It's 4 o'clock in Radio Cairo, and yes, it is the ABBA, and perhaps some of you, our dear listeners, have guessed. We have today the world of info, and we have such a great distinguished guest who was kind enough to come in our program before, and he came also another second time to tell us about his tenure in Egypt. Really, we are very proud to have His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tessleff of Sweden, who is a very distinguished diplomat. He has a degree in law and a master's degree in business, and he worked in the foreign service of the Swedish government for a long period, acting as a diplomat and working with the special envoy of the EU for peace in the Middle East, and an ambassador in United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Tunisia, and now he's ambassador in Egypt. Sir, thank you very much for coming. It's really a pleasure and so kind of you to come and share with our dear listeners your experience in Cairo, your experience in the Arab world, in the Middle East, in your third consecutive assignment here in the Middle East, with a lot of experience, expertise, and a flawless character that is so friendly and attractive to everyone who meets. Everybody who meets Ambassador Jan Tessleff thinks that this is a chance in a lifetime to meet such a distinguished gentleman with great experience and culture, and really sharing your wealth of information is a pleasure and honor to us here in Radio Cairo. Sir, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mabrouk. It's a great honor to be back on your show. I remember last time we spoke on the air, so to say. I was very new here. I had been here just for a few months. And now, after 2 years, to come back is a privilege to talk to you, to look at developments and to see where we are at between Sweden and Egypt. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, sir. And this is the World of Info from Radio Cairo, FM 95.4, coming live from Studio 3 with Dua Muhammad at the controls. I'm Dr. Amr Mabrouk, and stay with us after the break with His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tessleff from Sweden. So, Sweden is a Nordic country that lies in the north of Europe, and one of the very successful countries in the world, and a neutral country for the past more than 200 years, which helped the country to maintain its safety and its social welfare and well-being of its residents and citizens. And today we have the honor and pleasure to have His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tessleff, the Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, and we just go in the beginning to talk about Sweden, because Sweden continues to top the rankings in regard to innovation. So how does Sweden cooperate with Egypt on creative industries and innovation, sir?
Thank you very much for choosing that subject, because Sweden is a country that built its development on its natural resources originally. It was iron ore and wood and timber exports, and actually Egypt was one of the countries where we exported these goods in the past, and where we still do so. But just like Egypt, Sweden's greatest resource, and I think it goes for most countries, it's human resources. And we have gone to become much more of a service economy, an economy built on creation and innovation. And if you look at the different rankings in the world, be they European or American or whatever, we are at the top of those rankings when it comes to innovation, creativity, and startups. We are working and engaging very much with Egypt and with Egyptians on this. I see a great creativity in 100 million Egyptians, and a lot of let's say the new economy is coming out of young Egyptians, and I see a lot of similarities. How out of the creative minds of my country and the creative minds of Egypt, startups are coming up. We are actually now, in just a few days' time, having the Rise Up Summit here in Cairo, which is the biggest innovation summit in the Middle East. 8,000 people will participate. Sweden is having a delegation of about 30 people coming down. They are startups, they are innovators, they are social innovators. And we hope that this will lead to matchmaking between Egyptians and Swedes. I did the same thing in September in Alexandria. I was at the Techni Summit in Alexandria, also extremely dynamic. I saw how vibrant that part of Egyptian society is. And really, when I see the young business people, entrepreneurs in Egypt, the young innovators, the students, then I really feel the strength and the great promise for the future of Egypt and the Egyptian economy.
And I really believe that the fact that the investment in the youth and the young people is really very well rewarding. A country that is rich in such a young population and a young populous country like Egypt can really turn the fact of the overpopulation into a great benefit. If we are having 100 million mouths to feed, but we also have 100 million minds to think and 200 million hands to work. So I believe that with the fact of building on education and building on increasing the creativity margin in our population with such a great partner like Sweden, I think things can really get better.
I always say that one has to use all one's resources. And I sometimes seriously, but also a little bit jokingly, but seriously say that 100% of 100 million. Can you imagine what that can do? Yes. And that means that, of course, the creative minds, celebrating the brains of people, and also celebrating gender equality. To make sure that both men and women are on board when it comes to education, when it comes to job creation. All these things we are working very closely with our Egyptian friends. We are working with the government, members of the government. We are working with the National Council for Women. We are working with the UN organizations such as UN Women, with civil society to promote this. To make the most out of every single person.
Actually, we really part of this big part of this show will talk about the gender equality and the fact that Sweden is a pioneer in this field. We have to postpone this because there's a lot to say and talk and discuss. But definitely the idea of gender equality, or the fact that 100% of the 100 million people will be working and sharing in the load bearing, then this is very important. Sharing in load bearing is important, and definitely it improves how the world will turn around in Egypt with greater investment in education. That's what our president is trying to do. When we talk about Sweden, Sweden is the heaven of social welfare, and it's maintaining a Nordic social welfare system that provides universal health care and tertiary education for its citizens. And this is quite difficult, and it's very difficult challenge when we look to a country like the United States, the superpower of the world, and yet it is not able to maintain the standard of the social welfare that Sweden is having in different governments since quite a long time. So how was these different governments, with their difference in their political background, yet they were able, all of them, consecutively to agree about this social welfare system and maintain it? I think this was one of the toughest jobs and the challenges of Sweden, right?
You know, actually, the answer to that question is very much linked to the first question we discussed, this first issue. I think that the Nordic model, or the Swedish model, if we call it that is built on two things. One is that everyone basically should have be offered a job. So we have, when it comes to the labor participation rate, we are also at the top when it comes to that. So everyone somehow, if possible, should be given the chance to work. And by working, of course, you contribute to society. And the second aspect of that is that we have a long tradition, and I would say a positive tradition, of paying taxes. So, of course, the social welfare system is nothing that comes for free.
Yes.
And when people say that the government should provide for us, of course we know that that is not the truth. Everyone has to contribute to providing for society. Everyone has to play their role in bringing together the necessary resources for the healthcare, for the education, for all the other structures in society that we are enjoying. So there's been this tradition of trying to put as many as we possibly can. We've had for a record period of years a very, very low unemployment. It has changed a little bit in later years. I think it's the result of globalization and changes in more the global setting. We have today a little bit higher unemployment than we had in the past. And then to finance through taxes. I think that is two things. Another aspect is, which I think is very important, and I talk very often with my Egyptian friends about it, and I like to quote my prime minister, because he says to build welfare in any society, one should not be afraid of the new technologies. He says, I'm not afraid of the new technologies, I'm afraid of the old technologies. And what does he mean by that? He means that when our life changes through new innovations, through new industries coming into being, be it in ICT, for example, technology and other things, one must not resist. One must adopt those technologies, because sooner or later they will catch up with you. But what we have to protect, we have to protect the people, but not to protect the old technologies.
Because the problem which people are trying to protect the old technology, because this is going to get rid of the heavy populated industries. When you have a high-tech industry, you lose a lot of laborers in the way. And this will really can affect the social welfare system, because these people will be out of work. So the idea of your prime minister on working on this and saying that this is not going to be a demon, it's going to be an angel, really we need to elaborate on that. How can you really fight that back?
That's why your first question is so important. How do you provide the, let's say, the social safety net? How do you manage? Because one has to, of course, to look after those who, first of all, maybe temporarily lose their employment because of new technologies. But you have to put a lot of efforts into retraining them. You have to put a lot of into education, vocational training, etc. And that's what we have been doing over the years. We've been trying to resist to support industries that we are doomed, so to say. There are some, we had a shipbuilding industry in the past. We don't have a shipbuilding industry anymore. Other countries were more competitive when it comes to this. And on the other hand, we discovered and we developed other businesses where we now can have a good position. It is painful in the short run, but in the long run, I am convinced, we have been convinced, and I think Sweden proves it, that by having the social safety net, by putting people to work, but by insisting on paying taxes, which is important. We have high taxes, but it's also high value for the money that people pay. And I think that's very important to explain to people that, yes, you pay, you're sharing the taxes, but you also get something back.
You take care of the citizen from crib to cemetery, God forbid, right? More or less. So this idea is taking care is very expensive, and that's why if everybody pay his taxes, nobody is going to have a sheep right, but he will have an available right, as they say. But when you're talking about, since you brought the idea of the chip industry, which was very famous for Sweden, and of course the greatest car industries, without mentioning the name of the brand, but of course this brand now is working extra outside in overseas, right? They are not having their factories anymore in Sweden, but they're having, some of them they have it, or how far they are doing. I mean, part of the industry is the same is in the country or not?
Part of the globalized age that we live in means that ownership might be overseas. But if you look at our automotive industry, for example, but there are many other examples, it might have foreign owners today, But by being competitive, by having the technical edge that we have managed to keep many of the jobs in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
So
some
sometimes
of the factories are there, right?
Many of the factories, if you buy Swedish products, even if the companies are owned by foreign interests, they still create jobs. And I'm very often as ambassador in the situation of promoting Swedish design, Swedish products, Swedish services, because they originate in Sweden. But for me, it doesn't matter if they're owned by other interests, because it creates jobs, it creates value for Sweden, and that's what's important to me. I'm here to represent my country, to support my country, to bring revenue to my country and welfare to my country. And if the owners are in Singapore or in New York, the important thing is that the jobs, the creative side, are still in Sweden.
This is a very good start for our program, because after the break we'll talk about the demographic problems that Sweden was able to solve brilliantly, and I believe really brilliantly. So after the break we'll still be with His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tesleff, Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, who is really honoring us with his visit as a distinguished guest in Radio Cairo World of Info. I believe in angels, yes, and this is ABBA, and they are a Swedish band, and it's very lovable all over the world, and it's part of the soft power. How far of Sweden, how far is ABBA still affecting the world?
I think ABBA, they had they came out and they have their heydays from the early 70s until the early 80s.
Exactly.
A very short and extremely successful career. But they are one of the few bands, or maybe the band, that has managed to maintain their popularity. There's been the Mamma Mia movies, two of them.
It's a real resurrection, The Mamma Mia movie made the resurrection of ABBA again for the new generations of our children,
Absolutely.
My children didn't know ABBA, and now they are keeping their songs and they're cherishing them.
And the musicals on the big stages in London and New York and Stockholm and other places. I think they have managed to, and also they have artistically managed to keep their name, and there's never been any scandals around them. There's always been a positive image. So really, they are the soft power.
Even when they separated, they didn't have bad things to say about each other. And this is very important.
No. Everything has been. I think it's a lovely story, and it's something that we are all proud of. And when I sometimes feel a little bit down, maybe I'm tired, I still listen to ABBA, and that picks me up. And then I get new energy.
It picks up a lot of our emotions and morals, and you're not alone in that, really, actually. We all love ABBA, and we love the Swedish experience in demographics, because Sweden has a total population of 10.3 million, of which 2.5 million have a foreign background. Where from these foreign background citizens come from, and how far are they integrated in the society, because this is definitely something that's quite difficult. You were receptive in taking refugees, you've been receptive in taking immigrants, and this is a new idea. It's not since 100 years or so, no, but it's something new, and Sweden has improved this power. And you gave me a little secret that you want also to share with our listeners, right?
Absolutely. We have a very high percentage of people who are either born abroad or who have parents that are born abroad, because that's the definition of an immigrant, either parents born abroad or yourself born abroad. And in my case, my father was born abroad. He didn't come from that far away. He actually came in 1942 from Finland, our neighboring country. But I'm part of the statistics, let's put it that way.
Of course.
And I think actually being part of those statistics or that group is helping me in my job as an ambassador, because we all know, when we see the tragic consequences of migration, people who are forced to leave their countries because of wars and other factors. And we have seen that in the last few years. Sadly, we've seen it in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I think when I, as a diplomat, discuss these issues, I have at the back of my mind that yes, of course, I didn't have that traumatic experience myself, but my father came as a war refugee. He was wounded in his leg, and he was taken as a war refugee to Sweden.
He was a soldier then?
He had been a soldier. He was wounded when he was 16 years old in his leg, and instead of amputating his leg in Finland where he was taken in for medical care in Sweden. So somehow let's say the friendly face of accepting those who are in need was already there in the 1940s, because he came in the 40s. So that, I think, reminds us of Sweden's history. But we should also be reminded of something else, and we should be reminded of the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe.
Yes, exactly.
So now we talk about a developed, rich country in many ways, but we come from very poor origins. We were an agricultural country.
And some Swedes immigrated to the United States, right, and the New World.
Some Swedes, actually up to 1 million people, emigrated in those days. And they emigrated because the farming was not doing that well. The climate in the north is not that favorable always, and they couldn't find jobs, and they couldn't make ends meet, as we say. So they emigrated to find a new life. So today, when you look at, for example, the U.S., you have 3 million Americans who actually have very close ties with Sweden. So we have a big community over there, but we also have in Argentina, we have in other places, Australia, etc.
And Canada, of course, most.
And Canada also. But if you, as you mentioned, Dr. Mabrouk, in later years or in later decades, we have been receiving migrants and refugees to our country, and it started early on in the 1950s. But that was another kind of migrants. Then we received big groups of Italians who came to work in our car industry. Today we also have a sizable Italian community, and they went from being workers in the car industry to today being extremely successful in business. And they are, I was going to say they now own the car industry, but they own other industries at least. We had from the former Yugoslavia, we had also a big immigration, and we've had many migrants and refugees also coming from the Middle East. And of course, with the very tragic and difficult situation in Syria, for example, in later years, we've seen a big inflow coming from there, but also from other countries, some in Africa, some in the Middle East, Afghanistan, for example. We've had a big inflow. So, as you say, those who are part of the statistics, about 2.5 million people.
So this is a big sum of people who are coming from different backgrounds. How far they were able to be integrated? I think you had some problems, but you're always ahead of that, trying to solve these problems with more solutions. And were the solutions really successful?
I think that if we look over time, and I think it's actually, if we should be honest with ourselves, which we should, it is the case for most countries. Over time, immigration is good. We need to bring in new energies into our societies to make them not be stagnant. We need to have this exchange. And if you look over centuries in Europe and other places, these influx of people from outside has always been there. The challenge for any country is when the number of people who come across our borders are extremely high, for example, in 1 year or a year and a half or 2 years. Because it puts a strain on the medical services of the country, on schooling, because you have to provide schooling for the children, on housing, etc. So we had in 2015, 2015, we received 165,000 people in 1 year. That's 1.7% almost of our population.
Yes.
That, of course, put a heavy strain on our services and on our society.
And especially these people were not offered really jobs on the beginning, because so they were just a big load on the government for some while.
Yeah. And they have to learn the language, of course. They have to adapt. Of course, it's a new culture and everything. But I think that we have, if we look at it on a European scale, because I guess that's what we should compare ourselves with, I think we have managed to handle this reasonably well. I'm not saying that everything is perfect. It isn't, of course. But it takes time. We must remember that to come to a new country, especially if you're a little bit older when you come, to adapt to a new culture needs to take time. But in the long run, I think is beneficial for everyone. Then many people we've seen, when peace returns to their home countries, they also choose to go back.
You had this percentage, right?
And absolutely, and we have seen that in Iraq especially, where many of them have maybe acquired an education in Sweden, acquired skills, and then they've gone back home to apply those skills, be it they come from Erbil or they come from somewhere else. So it also has this kind of cross-fertilization between countries, which is important.
Pollen grain transfer, right?
Absolutely.
So when we talk about Sweden, that it ranks very high in the quality of life, the health, the education, the protection of civil liberties, the economic competitiveness, the equality, prosperity, and human development. All these are very positive sides of the community, but they were very difficult to achieve. How was that possible and guaranteed?
I'm again coming back, I think, to the participation of all in the building of society, in a realization among everyone, not only politicians but also ordinary Swedes like me, that we need to stick together to build a solid society. We have always also had the realization that we are not a big country, and I will tell you why it matters. If you see that you are middle-sized or small, you know that you depend on the rest of the world. And if you depend on the rest of the world, you will always have an international vision. So, for example, if we would like to manufacture airplanes or cars or something else, we know that our home market is too small to do so.
Exactly.
But if we look at the world market, we can very well build airplanes, we can very well build cars, we can very well do other things. ABBA, they didn't aim at Sweden, they aimed at the international scene.
Perhaps
from the
that's
beginning.
why they have chosen the English language, because it's more international in the beginning.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
They hardly did they, by the way, I mean, did they give any Swedish songs in the Swedish language, or almost all of them were in English?
Before they had their big breakthrough, they actually sang in Swedish. So there are some very early songs in Swedish, but after that, of course, only in English.
Really?
But I think it's symptomatic, to aim at the international scene. And if I can connect that to Egypt, when I meet young entrepreneurs, young business people, young innovators here, they don't see Egypt as the borders of Egypt as a limit for them. They look at the Middle East as their market. They look at Asia as their market. They look at the world as their market. If they have an innovation, if they have an idea, if they have a concept, they will not think about national borders anymore. They are global citizens. And I think that by having that kind of the awareness of the size, the awareness of dependence of others, you can actually achieve what we have done. Then there is another thing that I think is important, again, is that one has to... education is so important. How do you educate your children? How do you bring them up to become responsible citizens? How do you teach them about equal rights? And of course, you have obligations too. When you are a citizen, you have obligations, but you also have rights. Equal rights between men and women, equal rights between different categories, be it if they come from outside or inside the country. All these things, education is key.
Yes, of course. Well, after the break, with His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tesleff, Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, we'll talk about a very important topic, which I believe Sweden is a pioneer in it, which is the gender equality. So stay tuned with us in Radio Cairo, World of Info, FM 95.4. So we're still with World of Info, and our direct line is 257-8407, coming live from Studio 3 in Radio Cairo in such a beautiful afternoon. The weather is beautiful, and it's a beautiful day. We're having His Excellency Ambassador Jan Tesleff, the Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, telling us more about Sweden, and we're talking about a subject that I really carry a lot of respect. I'm a feminist by nature. I have aunts, I have sister, I have cousins, lady cousins, and so all my family has a lot of ladies, so I'm a feminist by nature. So when we talk about gender equality, I believe that it's a very important principle in Sweden. And Sweden has given us the example, and even in the 70s, there was a change of the law of inheritance in the throne. For the first time, the Swedish king decided that it should go to the firstborn child, whether it's a man or male or female. And by chance, it was Princess Victoria, who had the change of the fact that she was not born as a crown princess, but later on was changed to be a crown princess. And she's the second in line, or the first in line to the throne after her father. May he live happily in a healthy life. And definitely this is a very important step, how Sweden is going in gender equality. And I believe that a lot of big percentage of ladies are taking very high-ranking jobs in the government and in the business in Sweden. So how was that initiated, and how far did it reach the success that it is reaching it nowadays in Sweden?
I think now I'm coming back to what we discussed before, it comes from the conviction that everyone should be on board. Everyone should be part of building society, and everyone should at least be offered to have possibility to have a job when possible. So we have a very high percentage of women working outside the home. And again, it comes from everyone needs to be on board to create the welfare state or the welfare society. And it came also with, of course, with rights, political rights. We were not the first to have women voting, I must admit.
Yes.
I think in Europe it was Finland that was first out, and in the world I think it was New Zealand. But we were one of the first in 1921. We had the first
definitely before the
vote.
United States.
Yes, first we were out in 1921. So of course to be part of the political decision making is important. I always say that gender equality is important, but gender equality is not about mathematics only. It's not about having 50-50, because one has to look at also at having both women and men part of decision and policy making. So when I look at companies, for example, and they say we have 50% female employees, I say yes, but what do they do in the company?
Do they do just clerk work, or
Exactly.
they are in the decision maker?
Yes. So one has to do you have to look at the qualitative aspect of gender equality. Are we gender equal? The answer is no, not yet, but we are heading there. And also I'm very happy to see that there are 8 ministers in the Egyptian government, lady ministers.
Governors as well.
And governors, deputy governors,
Yes.
and governors, absolutely.
And a lot of plastic surgeons, by the way.
That I can imagine.
Like me.
And ambassadors, by the way,
Yes,
Egyptian
of course.
ambassadors abroad.
And one of the oldest foreign service, if I might add, that had adopted ladies and women in their service have been the Egyptians.
Absolutely.
Since the early 60s. And we have had very distinguished ambassadors, really, in the feminine side.
And that is why, exactly because of this tradition, that's why, as an ambassador, as the Swedish ambassador in Cairo, it's so easy to talk and work on these issues, and to engage with Egyptian counterparts, to engage with the National Council for Women, to engage with ministers on these issues, because it's something that is part of the Egyptian DNA also.
Yes, and you know the fact that when you look in the ancient pharaonic Egypt, you will always find the king and the queen sitting next to him, and not just going behind him. No, they are sitting together. They are sitting beside each other. When you see a Tutankhamun and his wife, or you see Nefertiti and Akhenaton, and you see the famous statue in the middle of the Egyptian museum, how big is the king, and also how big is the queen sitting next to him. And so it's a tradition in Egypt. So working on it is very hard. So tell us about the communication and the connection between Egypt and Sweden in this particular aspect, please, sir.
I was very honored this year because I was chosen, together with my EU colleagues, the EU Ambassador Ivan Surkos, to become EU gender champions for Egypt. And I would like just to take a few seconds to explain what does EU gender champion means. It's not something that is unique for Egypt at all. They exist in over 250 countries around the world. And what we do is, together with local partners, be it from government, from civil society, from international organizations such as the UN, we try to highlight and sometimes initiate initiatives when it comes to gender equality. I can give you a couple of examples.
Please.
We have highlighted, together with Egyptian universities, the importance of having women go into technical subjects, study engineering, which has been very heavily dominated by men traditionally. For example,
My daughter is an engineer, by the way.
I'm very proud of you, and I'm very proud of her. We, the other day, launched a big campaign together with Egyptian official partners against gender-based violence, domestic violence. That's another example of what we do. I was so proud to give 3 grants to 3 young Egyptian women to travel to Sweden at the Techni Summit in Alexandria in September. They are young innovators, young entrepreneurs, and they will now be able to go to Sweden fully paid for a visit to meet their counterparts. So that's just a few examples of what we do under the EU Gender Champion umbrella. But I also represent a government that is labeled as the first feminist government in the world. And what does feminist government mean? It might sound vague to some of the listeners, but it actually means that in whatever we do, whatever policies we formulate or whatever we implement, we always think of it in gender terms. We think about how women's rights are taken care of in the project, how women's representation, and what resources are allocated to women compared to men. So I always take very much care when I invite people to the residence or to the embassy to make sure that I have Egyptian women represented as much as Egyptian men. To be as truthful to this important subject at home is important, because otherwise you're not trustworthy. Yes. And we try to be trustworthy on this. If you look at our own scene, we have 12 out of 22 ministers are women, which is not bad. We have a very strong presence. Almost half of our parliamentarians are women. But again, it's so rewarding to talk to Egyptian counterparts, because I see the same move in the new Senate, in the new Parliament of Egypt, and we mentioned the government, of course. We see a drive when it comes to promoting women to higher posts.
And I think that we also have to give tribute to, for example, to Muhammad Ali, who started giving the women the rights when he started with a school for midwives in the early 19th century. When there was a revolution in education in ladies, with schools that are built in the 30s of the 20th century, when ladies started to enroll in Egyptian universities, when a lady like my mother went to university in the early 50s and to have a PhD in chemistry, and her sister to have a PhD in atomic energy from Stanford in the late 50s and early 60s, this gives you an idea that women were always edgy, they are always ambitious, and they really built generations behind them to follow their footsteps, whether these were their children or their grandchildren. And I really believe in the feminist cause.
No, I think that your own story is just an illustration of this, and I think that the most important thing, and I repeat it all the time, is that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that if we give an opportunity to a young girl or to a woman, that will take away an opportunity from a boy or a man. Because when everyone is working together, the cake, so to say, the cake will grow, and there will be more for everyone.
Yes.
So the zero-sum game, I don't believe in at all. The growing cake, and everyone will be better off. No one should feel threatened.
Yes, because this will take us to another important role of Sweden, which I really do respect, which is the role of Sweden in peacekeeping and peace preserving. And there has been light always in the end of the tunnel for Sweden. There has been always illuminating experiences. The Swedes, for example, and the great representation of Count Bernadotte during his, not only his efforts, aborted efforts in the Middle East, but his real great efforts that he has gained the knowledge and the fame, which is during the final days of World War II, and how he really helped very much in innovating and in peace. And also when we talk about the great Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary of the United Nations, General Secretary of the United Nations, and his role in trying to secure peace, and even his martyrdom in an accident when he was planning peace and tranquility for devastated nations in Africa. When we talk about these two important figures, we also have to talk and give a mention about the fact that they are Swedish, and how far is Sweden continuing in this role in the 21st century.
It's very much part of our ongoing DNA, so to say. And again, I think it originates from the fact that we are dependent on the world around us. We are not self-sufficient. So the security of others, the well-being of others, is a matter for us. I think that's and actually through the years, our politicians, shifting governments over the years, have all maintained the same policy when it comes to this, of maintaining the international engagement. We talked earlier a lot about peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is, of course, key, but also peace building, because I think that we see in many places that just because hostilities might stop in a country or in a region around the world doesn't mean that peace comes. We have to build peace over a long period of time.
Yes.
And usually the engagement, of course, of domestic actors, national actors, but sometimes also with the presence of international actors, is required for a longer period than in the past. And if I may connect to Egypt, because just like Sweden, Egypt has a long history of taking part in peacekeeping and peace-building operations around the world. Sweden and Egypt have served side by side in Mali, for example.
Yes.
We have also served side by side and worked on the same agenda items to a large extent when both Egypt and Sweden were on the United Nations Security Council. In 2017, we were there together. And actually, that time together on the council built a very close relationship between us when it comes to multilateral affairs. And I'm at the point of very soon flying down to Aswan in Upper Egypt for the Aswan Forum that is being hosted in Aswan now in December.
Under the patronage of the president himself, right?
Absolutely. And of course, as part of the presidency of Egypt of the African Union. So it will gather heads of state, heads of government, ministers from African countries all over the continent. And Sweden, and I'm very proud to say this, we are one of the strategic partners of the forum. There are other partners too. It's the Japan, Canada, and the United Kingdom are the national partners. And then there are UN partners like the UNDP, for example. But we are very, very happy, very honored to be part of this distinguished group. For us, Africa has always been very close to our hearts. We have very good relations. And we feel that the theme of the Aswan Forum, which is sustainable peace, security, and development, is key. Because there won't be any development if there is not peace. There won't be any development if there is not security. You have to look at all three together in one context. And that's what Egypt and the African Union members will do in Aswan.
So when we're talking about the cooperation between Egypt and Sweden, we have to give a mention to the long living relation of friendship between both countries, which, as you have just discussed in the beginning of the show, how we used to import, as Egypt, a lot of the raw products of Sweden, and how we had a lot of strong connections in relations, in exacting a lot of in our opinions, in sharing our opinions in bilateral relations and in multilateral relations. But tell us about the other things than the cooperation inside of the young entrepreneurs. What else of projects that you are doing with the Egyptian government beside the gender equality and the entrepreneurs, the young entrepreneurs?
Egypt is fantastic in the sense that it's a Mediterranean country. It's a Middle Eastern country, and it's an African country.
Yes.
And we are, and I say that initially just to come to try to answer your question. For us, Egypt is a very important partner in the region, very important also as a trading partner, as a country for investment, as a country for Swedish tourists. And I will elaborate if you allow me a little bit on that. Egypt is our second biggest market in the Middle East, our second biggest market in Africa. So very, very considerable partner when it comes to trade and commerce. We are focusing on a number of sectors. We are focusing very much on public transport, on mobility. We know that is something that is requested from the Egyptian side to improve transportation, public transportation. We have a good track record. We look at energy. We know that Egypt is becoming more and more an energy hub.
Yes.
Big findings of natural gas, but also a very solar energy, of course. So we are working together with Egypt on energy. We also know that Egypt is ambitious in making in financial technology. We are very advanced when it comes to e-payments and cashless society. So we are also having close exchange with Egypt in that field. Life science is a fourth area. 15,000 Egyptians are working in Swedish-related industries in Egypt. Not bad.
Of course.
Our trade went up 37% in the first 6 months of this year. Not bad. No, our tourism is growing this winter. Well, we usually say it fall and winter season because the high season for tourists is from October to April. Even though people come during other periods of the year, bookings have grown by 30% this year. Also, not so bad. So we are doing well. As ambassador, of course, I'm never happy. I think we can do even more.
Yes.
I'm working very actively and as ambitiously as I can together with Egyptian private enterprise, with the government, of course, to try to promote business and of course also to promote Egyptian imports to Sweden. Trade is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street.
Yes.
Trade should go in both directions.
Of course. Otherwise it's going to be a monopoly. Sir, it's really a pleasure to have you with us. But before we leave, we want you to promise that you will come again in our program, talk more about Swedish-Egyptian relations and talk more about Sweden, which is a country that I visited once and I would like to visit more because just to get more involved in understanding the brilliance of working and improving the welfare of the population. In this afternoon, we had the pleasure and honor to have with us His Excellency Ambassador Tesleff, Ambassador of Sweden in Cairo, who shared with us part of his vast experience so kindly and so honestly with his enormous wealth of information. Sir, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, and there is so much happening in our relations between Sweden and Egypt that without boring your listeners, I can come back in a little while. Thank you very much.
Please. This was World of Info coming live from Radio Cairo. My name is Dr. Amr Mabrouk. Dua Muhammad was at the control. We'll see you next week, same time, same station, Radio Cairo FM 95.4.